important conversation about health equity. My name is Kim R. Ford. I'm the proud president and CEO of Martha's Table, where we support strong children, strong families, and strong communities. And we are the award-winning Martha's Table. Now that the Washington City paper readers have voted us the Best of DC Pandemic Superstar for the best COVID-19 response. And part of that is, thank you for the snaps, I love that. Yeah, so part of that is because we never closed, we stood alongside and quite frankly behind the community, and have been so honored to let them lead the way and for us to be able to bring about important conversations like today about health equity. So we're very excited to have all of you. You guys all know that we've been around for 41 years and we are committed to advancing a more equitable Washington, D.C., where everybody has the opportunity to stay and thrive. Recently, we launched a 5-year strategic plan, 100% led by the community. We had thousands of voices in English, Spanish, and Amharic, focus groups with seasoned citizens, returning citizens, youth, and we had 5 themes come out of that. And one of the things that really was underlying everything is to make sure that there are deeper investments and commitment around health equity. And it wasn't just because of COVID, although obviously COVID exacerbated everything, but it wasn't just because of COVID. So it's a timely conversation because of COVID, which is not done, okay, which will continue in the communities we stand alongside. But before COVID and after COVID, we still have to have these important conversations about health equity. So I'm really excited about the panel that we're going to have today. We have some amazing people, Dr. GiGi El-Bayoumi, Dr. Wendy Ellis, Dr. Stevenson, and I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator and awesome friend to Martha's Table, Dr. C, which is Dr. Charlayne Hayling-Williams. She is a counseling psychologist trained in cultural competence, very important cultural competence, urban children, youth, and families, and complex social policy issues as they relate to economic instability. With over 15 years of experience in the areas of mental health, child and family services, policy, and consulting. She has worked closely with the systems that affect some of the most vulnerable families in the United States, including education, juvenile justice, public safety, healthcare, disability services, and workforce. As a senior policy advisor in the executive office of the mayor, director of treatment with the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, and director of programs and strategic partnerships in the private human services sector. I can tell you we are just going to have an amazing conversation today with the best of the best of the best across the country. So excited to turn it over to you, to Dr. C. And this is why we always say Martha's Table for the win, because I think we're probably one of the only organizations that could bring together such a star power panel. Dr. C, over to you.
Thank you, Kim, and good morning, everyone. This is more than an honor. I will begin by introducing our esteemed panel. Dr. GiGi, you and I had the opportunity to connect on the Ward 8 Health Council, and I must say, you've always been such an amazing resource and so community-driven and focused. It's really very impressive, and I personally thank you for the leadership you showed around vaccine clinics in Ward 8 and even our own vaccine clinic here at Community Wellness Ventures. So I will introduce you. Dr. GiGi is the founding director of the Rodham Institute. Her career focus has been on medical education, and she was previously the internal medicine clerkship director for 5 years before serving as the program director of the IM residency for 15 years. In 2013, she established the Rodham Institute, which is dedicated to improving health equity in Washington, D.C. Signature programs include the Health Education and Leadership Program, HELP, as well as CU City You Serve, which introduces, which introduces incoming interns to the city they will be training in. Welcome, Dr. GiGi.
Thank you for that generous introduction.
Absolutely. And Dr. Wendy Ellis, we also met at the Ward 8 Health Council and on the Building Community Resilience Task Force, which you so wonderfully lead. I love all of the really insightful things you brought to the field and sort of connecting public health and the pair of ACEs, of course, which we will get into. It's really informed my work. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce you to all of our guests. Dr. Wendy Ellis is an assistant professor in the Department of Global Health and founding director of the Center for Community Resilience at the Milken Institute School of Public Health at George Washington University. Dr. Ellis has spent the last decade developing strategic public health frameworks and working to grow a resilience movement. This body of work aims to address systemic inequities that contribute to social and health disparities that are often transmitted in families and communities from generation to generation. Welcome, Dr. Wendy. And last but certainly not least, now you guys, you want to talk about some sort of full circle moments that we have in life. There are moments that confirm for us that we're on the right path and also remind us that we're not as young as we once were and that time keeps on moving. So my introduction of Dr. Howard Stevenson and us landing in this place today is one of those moments. I have to tell you all that I met Dr. Howard Stevenson, the Dr. Howard Stevenson, as a precocious, maybe 22-year-old doctoral student at a conference at Teachers College at Columbia University. And I walked up to him and I said, I just ran down all of his research and how impressive it is and how there was no one in my current research team who was studying racial socialization. And I would just, so impressed. He said, okay, this is just so great. Would you like to join my research team? And wow. I really fainted and absolutely. And so I was in Philadelphia on a very regular basis and had the pleasure of having Dr. Stevenson co-chair my dissertation. So to now be introducing him on this panel over 15 years later is certainly a full circle moment. So hi, old friend and mentor. Dr. Stevenson is the Constance Clayton Professor of Urban Education, Graduate School of Education, University of Pennsylvania. He is the director of the Racial Empowerment Collaborative, promoting racial literacy in education, health, and community institutions, and former co-director of Forward Promise, which provides funding to culturally responsive, community-based organizations serving the health needs of boys and young men of color. His research focuses on helping children and adults develop and use assertive coping strategies during face-to-face microaggressions. Welcome to you.
Thank you, Charlayne. Thank you.
Of course. So I'd like to level set just a bit for all of our attendees. The disparities that we'll discuss today in health and wellness are not inherent to people of color. That is, we are not necessarily born with them. We don't come here with them. They are deliberate and systemic in nature, and so must be, shall be the solutions that we develop to ameliorate them. Equity is such an important conversation in every context and concept, as by 2020, this country will be majority minority. People of color will make up the majority of this country. And as it stands, people of color represent, of course, so many health disparities, including obesity, hypertension, cancer, and the like. And so when we really think about this, we're no longer asking people to do the right thing and pull on the heartstrings of America, as it were. It's really the necessary and only thing we can do by closing these gaps so that this country continues to progress in any meaningful way. So with that, I'd like to start with you, Dr. GiGi, especially considering all of the very important work you did or have done and are likely continuing to do around the pandemic in Washington, D.C., especially east of the river. Can you share some lessons learned and some observations this morning?
Well, thank you for framing this discussion because I think it's very important. I think when our work is coming from a socio-political, educational, economic framework, and I think that that's what is important to drive this because like Martha's Table, we believe that the community is the wise one, knows the solutions, is closest to the problems, of course, that they live on a day-to-day basis. And so they may not have the resources to solve the problems because frankly, the resources have been deliberately, if not taken away, but communities have been deliberately dismantled. And that is a long, long history in the United States of not just African-American communities, but of course, the original peoples, the first peoples, the indigenous peoples, and of course, any immigrants, recent immigrants that come around. So our philosophy or our mission is that we are consultants to the community. The community decides the priorities, and we try our very best to meet those priorities. And so actually the very first summit that we had 8 years ago, we simply asked the question, there was only one agenda item. We said, we want to be an action-oriented institute that doesn't study the disparities because there's enough data on that, but is really focused on solutions. And we asked, what should we focus on? And two things came up, education as well as food. Now, food at the time, I didn't understand, that crucial part, which of course is the number one social determinant of mental health. And education, of course, that's number one. If all I did as a physician was to get kids to graduate from high school in DC or anywhere else, we would add 10 years to their life expectancy. And right now in Washington, DC, there is an almost 27-year gap between people in life expectancy living in Georgetown and people living in Anacostia, which is the largest gap in the United States in any place. So that's sort of the premise or the philosophy that we have. And it was out of that philosophy that we came up with the 3 priority areas, which are workforce development, community collaborations, and then educating everybody in the healthcare system around what applied health equity is, the social determinants of health. Because I would say, especially given what's going on in Washington, DC, in Southeast, with all of these new health systems that are coming up, what we are seeing from academic institutions is the white man's burden. Going in to rescue communities, not realizing that communities are already doing things, community leaders are quite active, and that really the role of academic institutions should be one of supporting, leveraging their power to put pressure on whatever they can do, whether it's simple things like getting whoever their suppliers are, like Marriott, they say, okay, we're going to continue with you to do the laundry and all that in the hospital, but in exchange, you have to do this for the community, or you have to hire a certain percentage. So going back to your original question, we too, like Martha's Table, felt very strongly that we stand with the community, especially during times of trouble. So what we did is the following. We had webinars during this time where we partnered with churches, but this was open to everybody, and people want to see what we did, please visit our Rodham Institute website. It was called the Rodham Institute Impact Series. So we were initially educating around COVID, but then began to talk about what the issues were that came out of or were worsened by COVID. The second thing that we did is that we were fortunate enough to get a donation from somebody who had excess inventory, and we distributed 560,000 masks and hand sanitizers to our over 154 partners in Southeast. And then, of course, we've been doing meal delivery, but most important, we have stood by people. And we actually, on April 3rd, at Ms. Cora Berry's request, we vaccinated almost 900 people in Ward 8 on a single day. And it was not just the vaccinations, but rather, and just as importantly, bringing together all the academic institutions, Children's, Georgetown, GW, Howard, to work together. And also bringing in the mental health component, the food component, and the health literacy component. I'll stop there. I obviously have the gift of gab, and I want to make sure that I don't hog the discussion, because I want to learn from our other guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. GiGi. You brought up some extremely important points, of course. But, you know, one takeaway is specifically around the fact that we stand with and in partnership, facilitating growth and improvements in the community, recognizing the existing strengths and, of course, all of the talents that are there. So it's not what we do, but how we do it, and ensuring that we are appropriately aligned and aware of what we communicate, and in that knowing that the community has the solution. So thank you. And also thank you for highlighting the importance of the mind-body connection and mental health being central to our overall well-being. Coming over to you, Dr. Wendy. I believe it was in our first conversation, and it never really left me, your really thoughtful interpretation and perspective on the social determinants of health, and whether those factors are determining factors at all. Would you please talk to us first about just educating us all about the social determinants, and say a bit about your perspective and how we may focus and leverage our resources related to improving health disparities in that framework.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate this question, because I just want to dig deep. But, you know, I first off, you know, in answering your question, I think it's so important that we remember context over outcomes first. And then also that language matters, because language forms the narrative, and the narrative really forms how we think, what we know about these social determinants. So earlier, when you were doing your introduction, you spoke to the fact that by 2050, we will be a majority minority country. But I think one of the things that we need to tease apart here is how we use these words majority and minority, particularly in a political context. Because while we may be majority proportionally with regard to the population here, unless things change, we will remain a minority with regard to power. And that's really what majority versus minority means in the political context. Why does this matter from a public health perspective? Is because when we remain a minority, we do not have the power to actually move these levers that inform what you were asking about, the social determinants. The social determinants in and of themselves are not social, and they're not determinate, meaning that in the sense that when we look at things that we have considered social determinants, such as educational attainment, such as whether or not an individual is a justice involved, or whether or not an individual has a certain level of income, those things are not necessarily just fully by that person's control, but a lot of the other levers that they're able to access. And then, you know, from our perspective, the work that we do here at the Center for Community Resilience is also saying, yes, a person can attain a certain educational level, and that is one way to look at that person. But actually, educational attainment, when you look at it from a population perspective, is more a report card and a performance measurement of the educational system. And so this is where I, have been pushing levers to get us to think less about how is this an indictment on communities or populations, and more so, these are report cards on our systems. And that's why the majority minority status really matters, because it does not matter if we increase our numbers in population, if we do not actually exercise the power that comes with those masses. And this is what we have to be when we talk about equity writ large, why this is a calling card right now, an urgent calling card from a public health perspective, why we talk about voting rights is actually being the number one lever that we should be focused on with regard to achieving any level of equity. Because without that power to actually elect the individuals that will be putting our equity at the forefront, it means nothing to have a larger number of population. And so when, Dr. El-Bayoumi was speaking to various disparities in outcomes, we have to ask ourselves, how much are those outcomes actually a reflection of individuals' ability to access services, and more so about the larger contextual experience? And this is where we get into adverse childhood experiences and understanding the longitudinal impact that these adversities, how they build up and how they literally get under the skin. And so when we talk about these ACEs, and particularly even the fact, and this is why social determinants really is important, because there's a recent study by Bloomberg that was rating the best cities for African-American women. And so when we looked at the outcomes, Washington, D.C. actually ranks at the highest for economic mobility. But we still rank out of 50, number 8 with regard to maternal mortality. We also rank very high. We have almost double the national average with infant mortality. So what does that tell us for African-American women? You can go up the economic ladder, although we know that there's disproportionately a number of our sisters who are left behind. But regardless of the ability to attain education and to attain economic mobility, that you are still at a higher risk of dying dying during childbirth or having negative outcomes for your children. And so what does that really speak to? That's what the science of ACEs tells us. These aren't just social determinants in the sense of that woman did not receive a higher level of education, or that woman did not necessarily have a higher income, that regardless of attaining those things, the experience of racism is still influencing the outcomes that we see. And that this is not just good enough for one generation to be lifted up, that this is intergenerational transmission of trauma. And so that's why I say it is so important to not just focus on these so-called social determinants and reprogramming and changing behaviors, but we have to have some level of accountability for our systems. And so this goes back to my general point about it's not enough to have a mass in numbers if we're also not focused on how we're exercising our power, particularly right now under these certain conditions that we're in.
Wonderful. Absolutely. I think you always are so spot on. You brought up a number of things. My brain was just firing. I was thinking about where we began saying, this is systemic in nature and so deliberate. But the fact that both words obviously matter, and how important it is that we appropriately frame and recenter the conversation and to the place that it belongs, which is, putting the onus on the system for creating the outcomes it's designed to create. And until we understand that and really lean on and have the power that's required, regardless of our numbers, and we're healthy enough to really coalesce and build towards taking our country in the direction it needs to go by holding these systems accountable, we will always sort of be coming back to this place, but perhaps not using the wrong language to frame up the challenges, right? So, and also you talked about, and we'll come back to, of course, the pair of ACEs, but the direct linkage between adverse childhood experiences and physiological impacts. including, of course, trauma and mental health, again, continues coming up. And I'm always so happy to continue to tie that connection for everyone in shifting the narrative that mental health and behavioral health are public health. And so with that, we'll come over to our developmental psychologist and expert on race and racial socialization. And I'd like to start there, Dr. Stevenson. Can you frame up for us in the context of health disparities, how important the message is, as we're speaking about framing up the narrative correctly, the messages our folks are sent about who we are and our health and overall abilities to achieve our goals and take our power appropriately. What role does racial socialization play, and what exactly is it?
Thank you, Dr. Hayling-Williams, and appreciate the introduction. These 15 years have been good to you. I can see in your work and your impact on the community, which I remember you were so eager to address from the very beginning. To my colleagues, I think talking about the importance of power in systems is incredibly important, Dr. Ellis and Dr. El-Bayoumi. Thank you for that. And part of the work of racial socialization is a conundrum, though, about if systems change or when systems change. It's very important. Part of the question of racial socialization is, what do I as a parent or as a family do for my child today, tomorrow, when they walk into a school, when they walk into a playground, and how they're going to be walking down the street and treated. And so families for centuries of color have tried to share with their children strategies and messages on how to navigate racial hostility that impacts not only how they feel about themselves, how they see themselves and their narratives and their histories, but also affects their physical well-being. So we have enough data to know about the impact of racism on cardiovascular health, not only in adults, but also in children, as well as mortality. So racial socialization basically is a way, how do we protect our children from that toxicity that's coming in a variety of ways from people we thought would be there to protect and serve and care. And so the research on the talk, as it's often called, has found that children who receive more feedback on how to navigate these politics, even as young as preschoolers, are better around behavioral competence and cognitive competence, right? They're better in teenage years around managing anger and anxiety, around speaking up for yourself, confronting prejudice. And what we've learned, as important as it is, even parents who are able to deliver racial socialization in a way that they feel confident affects their mental health as well, particularly if we know parents of color have an added allostatic load or burden on parenting. We know parenting is like a lifelong acquaintance with helplessness, right? For every parent. But if you have to worry about your child leaving your house, going to school, going to after school, to the corner store and back home, and still being perceived as a monster or not a child, that burden, which we have measured as parental racial worry, worrying about racial profiling, that if you are engaged in racial socialization and you're confident that you're delivering it, your children are getting it, your mental health worry goes down as a function of that. So racial socialization has a lot of benefits. And we've been shifting from socialization as sort of like, be proud, be hopeful about who you are, to more racial literacy, which is around, what do I do when somebody's coming at me in less than 2 minutes, where I have a decision to make about how I'm going to stand up for myself or not. And we call that racial literacy. It's an extension of racial socialization, but we've been actually able to teach third graders to have a sense of noticing what's happening to my body, what's happening to my emotions and my thoughts in these 2 minutes, right? 2 minutes is a long time, right? Where some of the most egregious decision-making is happening to young people. But what if you could navigate and notice what impact these insults or supports are having to you in that moment, so you can make a decision to stand up for yourself and protect yourself and say, this is not about me. So racial literacy is an extension of racial socialization, and we think we're going to be able to get some more protective outcomes from young people and families as we do more of this work.
Absolutely. Can't say enough about, just how important it is to transmit the appropriate messages to our children and reinforce the skills that they are honing around knowing that their voice matters and that they don't have the responsibility of housing toxic stress and being repeatedly traumatized, which we know has, as we just said, long-term deleterious effects. I will come back to you, Dr. Stevenson, right now, just to follow up a little bit on the importance of racial healing work as we move towards a more equitable society and have Black and brown faces in more white spaces, which will ultimately bring up the necessity to be able to do this healing work even more, as we talked about just the outgrowth as populations. Can you say a bit about that and what some strategies might be or ideas around doing that work?
Well, if you look at, for those of us who are scientists in the scientific, more westernized world of thinking about change, we tend to focus on behavior change, right? We think about growth is if we can stop a particular behavior or increase another behavior, but healing brings in a sort of different understanding that there's more to a person than their behavior. It's about how they're seen, how much they appreciate their world or worldview, right? And so some of the healing work that we've been interested in is how do we learn from indigenous communities, cultures, and rituals where we can invest in science to open up its understanding about how to influence not only systems, but using theories of change that reflect the cultural worldviews of communities that have historically gone through struggle, but have also come up with strategies to navigate that struggle for centuries, right? So if I get a theory of change that's culturally responsive, can that drive the kinds of methods or measurements that I'm going to use and the interventions and practices that I'm going to use based on that culturally responsive worldview? And then the outcome. So we think of healing much more larger than changing behavior. We're thinking about healing of systems, healing some of the folks like Compadres Network out in California have been working not only with the young people in juvenile justice and health situations, but imagine them working with the parole officers who need healing as well, so that they are whole enough so that when they treat our young people, they see them as humane, not treat them in inhumane ways. So we have to think about holistically, if we take racial literacy to the jailers as much as the jailed, that opens up the door for possibility beyond just getting standard deviations in a place that we're happy with.
Absolutely. You're really getting my juices flowing about decolonization. We really have to think about this in a revolutionary sense. It's soup to nuts, top to bottom, bottom up, and all points in between. Comprehensive, holistic strategies rooted in truth.
Mm-hmm.
And equity is at the core of truth, for sure. When we help the most vulnerable, we help everyone. Coming to you, Dr. Ellis, as we talk about vulnerabilities, we can't talk about that without talking about those root causes and the soil and the paravases. Would you frame up for us first, of course, the ACEs, and then your work in paravases?
Yes, thank you. So let's get in the garden here. So, when I started in this work, it was really being inspired by the work of Anda and Folletti, who were the researchers who did the first ACEs study. And instinctually, it gave me an understanding of even my own experiences as a child, around what the different adversities were, and certainly the impact, whether that was mental or physical. And so when we talk about the ACEs, the classic ACEs are maternal depression, emotional and sexual abuse, substance abuse, domestic violence, physical and emotional neglect, divorce, mental illness, incarceration, and homelessness. But when I first looked at it, I said, well, wait a minute. I mean, I can certainly identify with those 10 ACEs, but what I didn't identify with was the fact that racism, the experience of that, is not considered one of the classic ACEs. Well, just to understand why it wasn't is because the original study group of which Anda and Folletti's work is based upon was upper to middle class white women in an obesity clinic at Kaiser Permanente in California. Okay. So that does not discount the science. It just means that when we, again, are not part of the research process, then we are not also necessarily included in the research results. And so I thought it was really important that we begin to understand that there are a number of different factors that can have the same impact as these 10 ACEs that will have the same longitudinal impact on individuals. And there's a physiological and psychological development. And so that was, at the same time as I was having that aha moment, Dr. Roy Wade in Philadelphia was also launching the Urban ACEs study. And that also filled in what I knew intuitively, and almost any person of color would have read those first ones and said, I think there's something missing here. This is a good start, but there's something missing here. But then when we talk about, if we're beginning to recognize the experience of racism having detrimental physiological and psychological impacts, then that brings us back to the soil. So what exactly is that community that we're implanted in, that we are planted in? What are the drivers of these adversities? So these things don't just happen to people. And a lot of times this structural violence is what perpetuates the interpersonal violence. And so understanding that poverty, discrimination, community disruption, the lack of opportunity, economic, mobile, and social capital, those types of things, the housing quality, whether or not it's even affordable, that's going to create potentially homelessness as an outcome, or the lack of social economic mobility may actually be what perpetuates the maternal depression. So it's not enough to just focus on those leaves and the branches, meaning those things that we can see, those 10 classic ACEs and then some. It's enough. We have to really understand what is happening in the environment. So yes, there's this adage right now, not what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you. And I would say, but what's wrong with the environment? What's happening in the soil in which these individuals, these children, and these families are planted in? And so that is where I really feel like for a field, we have to go beyond just the administration of care and really put these systems to task. So as I was saying before about the measurement piece of this, there's so much talk about equity. And then, folks are like, oh, but how it's squishy. How are we going to measure this? So, well, honestly, we're already measuring disparity. There's no magic wand here where we have to go under the hood and research this anymore. If you flip the disparity measurement, then that's telling us how far we are from equity. If we know that we have in certain zip codes a disproportionate number of individuals who are not being able to afford affordable housing, then I would think that it's not just their behaviors, but it's also something with what is lacking in that environment that actually gives them access to a livable wage. It's not just whether or not housing is affordable. It's also asking the question, well, why can't people afford the housing? Why is it that it's so priced out of what an average person can afford? Then we have to start having tough conversations about, are we paying people a living wage? You cannot go around these issues. We cannot solve these issues by just merely changing behaviors. We're not going to program our way out of this. And so this is why it's so important for us to use the entire set of data, suite of data, for us to look at, not just merely focusing on outcomes, but we also have to focus on our systems and keep our systems accountable. And that's why, you know, I said in my earlier remarks that we cannot just look at these so-called social determinants and then turn the lens on the individuals. That's looking downstream. If we truly want to change the outcomes, then we have to look at the systems that are producing these outcomes reliably, predictably, and intentionally. And so that's the harder conversation. That's certainly the harder amount of work, but I guess I'm here for a reason. And there are plenty of other communities that have jumped into this to understand. And I do want to do this level set. We talk about the pair of ACEs, and when we talk about resilience, there's one other thing that I would like for us to set our aspirations a little bit higher, particularly when it comes to resilience, is that in our work, you know, I am not applying a term from physics to the human spirit. Meaning that when we talk about resilience, and if you look it up in the dictionary, it will say an object's ability to retain shape after suffering impact. And okay, first off, I don't want to apply that to anyone. But when we're looking at this through an understanding of equity, if we are saying that we want our communities to be resilient, but we only understand resilience to be that of which it's an individual or community bouncing back, get out of the game. You're not really understanding what we mean by equity. When we say resilience, community resilience, that means not only are we trying to actively prevent the onset and the experience of trauma, but we recognize that where they're starting from is not a place that we want to be happy, like, oh, good job, we've bounced you back. No. From an equity standpoint, we recognize that, yes, we want to heal people, we want to make people whole, but in order to be a truly resilient community and to provide that healing, we have to be honest about what are the supports and buffers that are needed to not only help them bounce back, but to help them bounce forward and thrive. And that's a full stop there. And so I am saying, and I am pushing the field and those that we work with to, like, we have to go beyond just thinking that whole is less than for some communities. Whole means whole for everyone.
Absolutely. I think the next series, we're going on the road with this one, questions that need answers. I often ask similar questions in the context of community violence and strategies that should and will work if we sort of reframe the onus and ask the right questions. Why are we here and how did we get here? Who are the culprits really, and what systemic factors keep those things in place? Coming over to you, Dr. GiGi, as we ask this last question before going to the audience, as a physician, the only physician on the panel, I'm reading a very interesting text currently, The Body Keeps the Score. And, you know, really tying together the physiological components that result from ecological factors, contextual factors, especially traumatic instances. What can you tell us about health education and what parents can do, and young adults and everyone really across the lifespan to equip themselves with the knowledge necessary to be advocates and really take charge of their health to begin to close some of these physiological health disparities?
So thank you for that question. But before I answer that, just a couple of points that I wanted to make in response to what has already been said. I think it's time that we call out the system for what it is. We have a healthcare system that is really an apartheid system. And so when we think about majority minority, I want to remind people of what South African apartheid used to look like, or even current examples of Palestine. Just because you have the numbers, again, does not mean that you have the power or control. So that's number one. Number two, When you look at 80% of the healthcare workforce are actually non-physicians and non-nurses. So for the systems that exist in which gender, class, race are, again, they're in the very foundation of how these systems were created, that's when we need to really call apartheid what this system is, and that is apartheid. Of course, COVID made these things worse. Of course, what COVID, the pandemic, did was actually open the rest of the world's eyes to how bad things are here in the United States. So actually, we are working with the Unrepresented Peoples Organization, which is an offshoot of the UN, which Ralph Bunche III, Ralph Bunche's grandson, started to, we're going to be making the case that having no representation as Washington, D.C. is driving these public health outcomes. Remember that because we were considered a territory and because our budget is controlled by Congress, we got only 1/3 of the stimulus package that other states did because we're considered a territory. Now, Harris and Biden released the 2/3, but we cannot be, you can't run a city based on the whims of what Congress, if it's a Republican Congress, is going to do or not. And what I would recommend for everybody is to watch a movie. Full disclosure, my nephew was one of the co-directors. It's called The Last Battlefront, and it was just aired on the PBS stations, and it will continue to air because it's really about the history of DC, how we got the voting rights, when we got the voting rights, and how Jim Crow and redlining has really driven these outcomes, and how this is all, of course, interrelated. I do want to come to a point that Dr. Ellis made, which is about maternal mortality. Even when you correct for the education of an African-American woman, their outcomes in maternal mortality are worse than a white high school dropout. Just let's reflect on that. And that's why it's important to get at the granular information. I'm not surprised that DC is #1 in terms of economically for African-American women, because let's look, it's where those economic opportunities are. They're not going to be in Southeast. You're going to, if you divide that information up, you're going to find wide disparities. I think also, I remember I was born and raised here, but I'm of Egyptian heritage. So Dr. Stevenson, I did not realize what my parents were doing were actually protecting. I am not part of the African diaspora. I'm coming directly from Egypt. The experience, of course, nobody can match the experience of the African diaspora, but I consider myself an honorary member because being born in Tallahassee, Florida, I will never forget. I was 7 years old when my dad had the talk with me. He said a couple of things. If you see a car door open, do not go and close it. I'm like, why, Baba? He said, because you may be accused of theft. We got a little bit older. He said, if you have a broken taillight, go directly to the gas station to get it fixed. I don't care how much it costs. Do not argue with a policeman. So when I was in Northern Virginia as an adult driving and in Springfield, and I got stopped by the police, I don't know why. Yes, sir. You people from Washington, D.C., he banged on the hood of my car, don't know how to stop at stop signs. Of course, I had to be very cool. And I was very frightened. I have, learned to be frightened, sadly, from white people in Virginia. I never set foot there if I can help myself. So let's get back to the question that you asked, because it is about the physiology. What happens to a young person or a child or, any of us? So let's talk about the neurophysiology. The amygdala, that walnut-sized structure in our brain, is responsible for flight or fright. That's what's protected us as human beings. That's allowed us to survive when we're being attacked by a lion and to get out of that. The problem is that racism is constantly having that amygdala fired. I'll give you an example again from my family. My niece was 9 years old at the time, called me up, and she said, Auntie, I smell an electric smell in the house, and Mommy's not listening to me. I said, okay, let me talk to your mother. She said, oh, yeah, there's no, I said, call the fire department. My sister's like, no, what are they going to do? I said, just call the fire department. I don't know what they're going to do. They get there and they said there was an electric short and the whole building, the whole house rather, would have been gone in 15 minutes. So I called my niece up. I said, you saved the family. Well, she was still very, very anxious. I said, what did you learn in peace class? She said, I learned that the amygdala is still firing, but I need to talk to the prefrontal cortex to tell it to calm down. I said, okay, how are you going to do that? I'm going to breathe. I said, let's breathe together. And we did, and she felt better. And of course, I felt better. That kind of education where children and adults know what is happening to their bodies and how to temper and get themselves back in control will not only help her as a child in focusing on education or anything else, but will help her in terms of her health outcomes. We know that continuous stress increases cancer risk. I personally have had cancer not once, but twice. It increases mental health problems. It increases all the chronic diseases that we see. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Wonderful. I think that's a perfect place for us to stop today. Let's breathe together. We have to take a moment, take it all in, check in. And as we love to say at Community Wellness Ventures in partnership with Martha's Table, take a moment to have that checkup from the neck up. We have to be present. We have to be healthy and whole to continue the all important work of lifting as we climb toward a more equitable, healthy, fair, grounded America, and really the world at large. I will end with, I've really been impressed by Angela Glover Blackwell's work on equity, and she calls it the curb cut effect. And if I can leave you all with this, when curbs were literally cut, the thought was that it was really for people who had limited or restricted mobility, people who use wheelchairs, crutches, or some differing abilities, right? And there was a lot of resistance. Why would we go through cutting every curb in America for that small fraction of the population? And what we learned and what we saw soon after the curbs were cut was that joggers, delivery people with dollies, people who were traveling with luggage, mothers and fathers and caregivers with strollers, everyone essentially benefited and utilized the curb cuts. So with that, let's ground ourselves in the knowing that equity for one is equity for all, and certainly let's do our part in cutting the curbs when we can. Thank you all so much. I see a few questions in the chat. We will follow up. We will get some resources out to you. A recording will be shared. I am so grateful for this opportunity. You all have been so wonderful. Martha's Table, Community Wellness Ventures remains so eager and happy to serve in partnership with you, the greater Washington, D.C. community right here in the Great Ward 8. We will continue to do some amazing things together and be accountable for the results that really matter. Thank you all. I think
Thank you so much, Dr. C, Dr. GiGi, Dr. Wendy, Dr. Stevenson, just doctor. I love it. Thank you, guys. How did we only book this for an hour? I mean, we've been I'm getting texts and emails, just people are, we're just so drawn to this conversation. We will definitely follow up with all the questions that are in the chat box. And please reach out at any time for any additional questions. I just got a note that said, man, we need to have a whole mini conference on this. So we will follow up with you. And again, I just want to thank everybody on the call. I want to thank Dr. Steve for your moderation. And for anybody who would like to support Martha's Table, please know that our harvest dinner is coming up on November the 20th from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., where people will have the opportunity to have a healthy meal for Thanksgiving. We'll have community outputs and offshoots all throughout the community, and we're going to have a coat giveaway with over 5,000 coats. So we look forward to seeing you. Thank you again to everybody on the panel. Thank you for this enriching conversation. And again, Martha's Table for the win. We appreciate y'all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You can keep an eye out for a follow-up email from Martha's Table, including additional resources and a recording of today's conversation. Have a wonderful afternoon.
Bye-bye.